Ibrahim Traoré and the Venezuela Playbook the U.S. fears. The world believes the chessboard is quiet. No new sanctions, no new speeches, no headlines screaming crisis. But this silence is not peace. It is calculation. Empires do not retreat when their weapons fail. They adapt. For decades, sanctions were the master key. Freeze the accounts, block the ports, control the currency, starve the nation until it begs for permission to breathe. This strategy worked because it relied on visibility, on tracking, on obedience. But something has changed. Across the global south, nations have begun to move without asking to be seen. Gold no longer waits for London. Oil no longer needs New York. Trade no longer asks SWIFT for approval. And when sanctions stop working, the empire does not give up. It makes a countermove. This is the story of that countermove, and why 2026 will decide whether Africa rises as a producer or is shattered from within. Stay with this until the end. Because what comes next is not economic. It is existential. For decades, this method worked almost perfectly. But something fundamental has shifted. Venezuela was supposed to collapse. Iran was supposed to surrender. Russia was supposed to implode. Instead, they adapted. Not overnight, not without pain, but decisively. They learned that the power of sanctions depends on visibility and compliance. Once you stop asking permission to be visible, the system begins to fail. This is the moment the empire fears most. Not resistance, but learning. The global south is no longer experimenting with survival. It is institutionalizing it. And Africa, particularly the Sahel, has been watching closely. Every tanker seized in the Caribbean, every account frozen in Europe, every shipment delayed by compliance reviews has become a case study. Not in how to protest, but in how to redesign an economy. This is why sanctions are losing their effectiveness. They were built for a world where trade routes were fixed, currencies were centralized, and production was outsourced. That world is dissolving. When gold is refined at home instead of exported raw, sanctions lose leverage. When food is grown domestically instead of imported, blockades lose power. When energy is processed locally, embargoes become symbolic. The empire understands this. That is why the strategy is changing. When economic strangulation fails, the next weapon is internal fracture. History leaves no doubt. Yugoslavia, Libya, Iraq, Syria. Each case followed the same sequence. First sanctions, then humanitarian concern, then internal divisions magnified until cohesion collapses. Ethnicity becomes a fault line. Religion becomes a wedge. Political disagreement becomes an existential threat. Fragmentation is not accidental. It is engineered. Africa now stands at this precise inflection point. The Sahel is no longer peripheral. It is resource-dense, geopolitically central, and increasingly coordinated. Gold, uranium, lithium, oil corridors, and demographic growth converge here. For the empire, this makes the region too valuable to lose and too dangerous to allow autonomy. This is why coordination terrifies them more than strength. A weak but unified bloc is more dangerous than a strong but isolated state. Unity allows trade without intermediaries, intelligence sharing without permission, defense planning without dependency. Above all, unity allows narrative control. Narrative control is the true battlefield of 2026. Watch the language shift. When a nation produces independently, it is labeled authoritarian. When it restricts capital flight, it is accused of corruption. When it controls its resources, it is called anti-democratic. Democracy in this framework is not about citizens. It is about access. Access for corporations, access for financiers, access for foreign leverage. The lesson from Venezuela is not ideological. It is structural. A nation cannot survive modern warfare with soldiers alone. It must defend its economy, its logistics, its information space, and its food supply simultaneously. This is what total sovereignty means. Not isolation, but resilience. Food sovereignty ensures that no sanction can induce hunger. Financial sovereignty ensures that no bank can freeze a future. Industrial sovereignty ensures that no embargo can halt production. Information sovereignty ensures that no foreign narrative defines reality. This transforms the citizen from a spectator into a participant. The farmer becomes a defender of national security. The engineer becomes a strategic asset. The worker becomes part of the front line. When people understand this, sanctions lose their psychological effect. Fear only works when dependency exists. That is why the empire targets production first, because production creates confidence. And confidence is contagious. Every time a country announces a refinery, a factory, or a grain surplus, the response is immediate. Reports appear. Ratings are downgraded, protests are amplified, opposition movements receive funding. This is not coincidence. It is counterinsurgency adapted to economics. But the empire is miscalculating one thing. It assumes populations remain passive. The most dangerous development of this decade is not weapons proliferation. It is the politicization of the economy at the citizen level. When people understand how trade works, how sanctions function, and how dependency is enforced, manipulation becomes harder. This is why civic military models matter, not as militarization, but as integration. A professional army can be isolated. A mobilized society cannot. When logistics, production, and defense are socially embedded, decapitation strategies fail. Venezuela demonstrated this. Despite a decade of siege, it preserved internal cohesion by linking survival to participation. The Sahel is decoding this lesson in its own context. Different history, same principle. 2026 will not be defined by whether sanctions are imposed. They already are. It will be defined by whether they still matter. The next phase is not resistance. It is scale. Raw materials are no longer enough. Exporting unprocessed resources guarantees vulnerability. The future belongs to finished goods, regional value chains, and intra-South trade. When trade shifts laterally instead of vertically, control evaporates. This is why fragmentation must be prevented at all costs. Once industrial capacity reaches critical mass, sanctions become noise. Once food security is achieved, pressure loses urgency. Once financial clearing occurs outside hostile systems, leverage disappears. At that point, the empire has only two options: adapt or destabilize. And history suggests it prefers the latter. This is why unity is not a slogan. It is a defense mechanism. The chessboard has changed. The empire is no longer playing against individual states. It is confronting networks. Africa linked to Latin America, Asia linked to the diaspora, resources linked to production, capital linked to labor. This is what terrifies them. Because empires do not collapse when defeated. They collapse when ignored. When trade routes bypass them. When currencies settle without them. When narratives circulate without their approval. 2026 will be the year this becomes irreversible, or the year fragmentation succeeds. The outcome will not depend on speeches or summits. It will depend on factories, farms, refineries, banks, and whether citizens understand that defending production is defending sovereignty. This is no longer a theoretical debate. It is the decisive phase of the game. The age of begging is ending. The age of building has begun. They will call it dangerous. They will call it radical. They will call it unrealistic. But history is written by those who produce, not those who permission seek. The board is no longer theirs alone. The pieces are moving without their approval. And for the first time, the empire is reacting, not commanding. This is not the end of the game. It is the moment the pawns became architects. And in 2026, the world will learn a truth it tried to forget. A nation that feeds itself, finances itself, and believes in itself cannot be sanctioned into silence.